Sure. My name is Michael Mann. I am a professor here at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science, and I also direct the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media.
Could you tell us a little bit about your most recent book?
Yes, my most recent book is called The New Climate War, and it's really about the new challenges that we face when it comes to the battle to address the climate crisis. Now that we have evolved beyond climate change denial, because it's just not possible for critics to claim that climate change isn't happening anymore. We've seen a new array of tactics that are still intended at preventing the needed climate actions, delay, deflection, division, and even doom mongering. If we can become convinced that it's too late to do anything about the problem, it potentially leads us down the same path of disengagement as outright denial. And so I talk about all of those challenges, those obstacles, and how we can get around them, because they really are the only obstacles now in the way when it comes to taking the necessary actions.
Okay. If you could answer this as a statement, personally, where do you feel we're at in the process of self-destruction or survival?
Well, we're making some real progress, and the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States puts us on a path that doesn't quite get us where we need to be. We need to reduce carbon emissions by 50% within the next 8 years if we are to remain on a course of keeping warming below a truly dangerous 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. But we're starting to get on the right path, so we're making progress. We need to make a whole lot more progress. And that means getting off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. It also means adapting to those changes that are baked in and investigating ways of sequestering carbon, drawing down carbon from the atmosphere at the same time.
We don't really want to let catastrophes go to waste. Do you think that what people are experiencing at the moment is pushing them more effectively than the denialism that's going around?
Yeah, I think denial just isn't credible anymore, because people can see the impacts of climate change playing out in real-time disasters that we are forced to deal with. And I think that played a role, frankly, in the climate legislation that finally passed the U.S. Congress, the first climate legislation to ever pass the U.S. Congress and be signed into law by President Joe Biden. There was a Democrat, Joe Manchin, a coal state Democrat who has been averse to climate action in the past, but I think he's hearing it from his own constituents in West Virginia who are experiencing devastating floods and other devastating impacts of climate change. So yeah, I think there's a whole lot more pressure on politicians now to do something. Again, we need to do a whole lot more than we're doing, but we're starting to get on the path that we need to be on.
Speaking of reactions, I completely understand why you wrote that book. What kind of reactions have you had from that book, and do you think it's helped to shift the needle?
Yeah, I like to think that that the New Climate War sort of awakened people to the insidious tactics that are now being used by polluters, by what I call climate inactivists, those who are trying to block climate action, fossil fuel companies and conservative media outlets and politicians who support their agenda. I felt it was important, as somebody who's been on the front lines of this battle, and I've seen the enemy up close, and I can see how they've shifted their tactics away from outright denial, because it's not tenable anymore, to these other arguably more insidious tactics, dividing us, getting us fighting with each other so we're not holding polluters accountable, deflecting attention away from the needed policies and systemic changes to individual behavior as if it's just about us changing our light bulbs or changing our means of transportation. What we need is a fundamental systemic change. And so the purpose of this book was sort of to awaken people to the tactics that are being used to prevent us from taking the needed action. And I've gotten some real positive feedback from people who've read the book. The Financial Times It was runner-up this year in Financial Times Business Book of the Year. I didn't expect to win an award from, related to business. It wasn't really a book that was written about business, but I think there's a recognition that climate change is so pervasive, it now impacts every sector of our environment, every sector of our economy, and so really it is about business. It's about the economy, it's about everything. Climate change is the greatest threat that we face as a civilization, and I feel like, it was the right time for this particular book. I hope that it spurs or helps spur that accelerated action that we need to see.
I was up in Canada recently with Bill Rees, talking about overshoot amongst other things. Can you just talk a little bit about, consumption and, infinite use of finite resource and
Sure.
how that needs to change, and are people starting to get that?
Yeah, so the climate crisis is this immediate crisis. We've got to reduce carbon emissions by a massive amount, 50% within the next decade. And so I often argue that we sort of need to work within the system that exists to affect those near-term changes that need to happen now. At the same time, ultimately, we need to think about changing the system fundamentally, moving away from a resource-driven, extraction-driven global economy, because ultimately that is on a collision course with environmental sustainability. We can't continue to use up natural resources at accelerating levels and expect to live sustainably on this planet. So ultimately, we need to move away from that. But in the near term, we need to work within the system that does exist to reduce carbon emissions, to get off fossil fuels, to decarbonize our society as quickly as possible.
In broad principles, and I'll ask specifically, in broad principles, what are your thoughts on restoration? In terms of in and of itself, but also the importance of it as part of the total solution.
Yeah, I think climate restoration makes a whole lot of sense. First of all, because it's win-win. Healthier ecosystems, a healthier environment, thriving forests, a better planet is obviously better for us and all other living things. And so it's a no-brainer to try to restore our environment as much as we can to a functioning global ecosystem. At the same time, it does help, at least at the margins, in reducing carbon emissions. I mean, let's not mince words here. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. We are not going to address the climate crisis without moving away rapidly from our continued reliance on fossil fuels for energy and transportation. That's job one. But at the same time, to accomplish the reductions that are necessary to avert catastrophic warming, we have to be looking, in addition, at natural ways of capturing and burying carbon. And again, they're win-win. Reforestation, afforestation, healthier ecosystems, it's good for the planet, and it will help at least a bit in lowering those carbon emissions and drawing down that carbon so that we can keep those CO2 levels below truly catastrophic levels of warming.
So there's some of the arguments against it is that if we push the restoration thing, then it's giving a free ticket to industry and so forth. Another of the challenges is, and I'll go through the four things that we've been looking at, is that we're looking at them on a micro scale, but when you take them to actual scale, then there's just so many variables. That doesn't seem to be the case with some of them, but certainly it may be with the others. The ones that we're looking at are artificial limestone creation, which is Blue Planet, seaweed permaculture, which is with kelp, sargassum, and other seaweeds. Ocean iron fertilization, I guess you know a bit about that. And then acceleration of natural methane oxidation, which people like Rob Jackson are involved in. So just generally, your thoughts on them, because there's a push to get to scale, because that would make a difference.
Yeah, so, there is always the danger, and there's a danger when we talk about adaptation, when we talk about natural climate solutions. There's the danger that polluters will try to exploit that by saying, yes, yes, this is the solution. We don't need to stop burning fossil fuels. We just need to adapt to the changes that are coming, or explore natural solutions, or engage in geoengineering, massive interference with our planetary system in the hope that that will somehow offset the effects of global warming, of human-caused climate change. So we have to be wary of the use, the weaponization of adaptation, natural climate solutions by polluters as a deflection tactic, as a way of deflecting attention away from the action that they really don't want to see, the decarbonization of our economy. That having been said, there is real merit in, we've got to adapt to the changes that are baked in. So we're going to need to adapt. We need to prevent what warming we can while adapting to those changes that are now baked in. Similarly with natural climate solutions and, for example, using kelp in the oceans to absorb more carbon, I think it makes a lot of sense. Looking at accelerating natural ways of capturing methane. There are a lot of ideas out there that are worth exploring, and they will help. They are not going to accomplish the lion's share of needed reduction in atmospheric carbon, but they will help us achieve those targets because we've got a lot of work to do. If we're going to reduce carbon emissions by 50% within the next 8 years, we're going to need all the tools in the toolbox, all of the safe tools in the toolbox. And there are a number of tools that make sense in using when it comes to natural climate solutions, carbon drawdown. We should be exploring these things.
Personally, where do you feel we're at? What do you think our chances are? What do you think of that?
Yeah, so, it's a monumental challenge, decarbonizing the global economy essentially in 10 years, bringing carbon emissions down by 50% within the next 10 years. A year ago, I might have said it's looking unlikely, given that we weren't seeing the leading industrial nations of the world taking the leadership roles that they need to. But in that time, we've seen a new government elected in Australia that is prioritizing climate action. We've seen something that we just didn't think was possible, meaningful climate legislation passed the US Congress with a 50-50 Senate. And so there's been enough progress that I think it's fair to say we're not there yet. We've got a whole lot more work to do, but we can start to see a path forward now where we will meet those targets. If we double down, if we don't rest on our laurels, if we take the win that we have now with the Inflation Reduction Act, but we elect more climate hawks to Congress in these upcoming midterm elections so we can enact more aggressive climate legislation that calls for even faster decarbonization, that prices carbon, that provides greater subsidies for renewable energy, that does enable some of these natural climate solutions at the same time.
Just a slight variation on that. So in your gut, because it isn't about the science, it's about behavior and choices and so forth, what's your gut tell you? Do you think we've got it in us to make those decisions?
Yeah, as a climate scientist, I can tell you that there are no physical obstacles. We can keep warming below 3 degrees Fahrenheit, a level of warming where we will start to see the worst consequences of climate change. There are no laws of physics that get in our way that tell us that we can't do that. The only obstacles at this point are political will. And I have some faith, if you want to call it that we will ultimately garner the political will to take the actions necessary, but it's not going to happen without pressure from all of us. Sometimes it means people being out in the streets, demonstrating and demanding that our politicians take the actions that we can't do ourselves. We can't put a price on carbon ourselves. We can't subsidize renewable energy. We can't enact energy conservation measures. We can't deploy natural climate solutions at scale ourselves. We need our policymakers to support those actions that we can't do alone, but are necessary if we are to address this crisis.
That's great, thanks.
All right, is that a wrap?
You did record, didn't you?